The fever took everyone but us. Two sisters arrived half-starved that spring. The first thing I noticed was the flour sack. One of them was holding it against her chest the way a person holds something that's all they have left, which it probably was. It wasn't even full. You could see the bottom corner pressed flat where there wasn't enough flour to round it out. And still, she was holding it like it was worth holding. That was Clara. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know anything about her yet except that she was standing at the edge of my north field with her sister half a step behind her, and the two of them had the look of people who'd been walking a long time and were trying not to show it. I was mending fence line that morning, April just barely. The ground was still cold enough to ache if you knelt on it too long, and the sky had that white, used-up look it gets before it decides whether to give you weather or just stay mean and still. I'd been out since before light. I had 80 head to move before the week was out, and 3 sections of fence that weren't going to hold them, and I was in no particular mood for strangers. I set down the wire. She didn't flinch, I'll give her that. A lot of people flinch when they see a man my size coming across a field at them. I don't do it on purpose. It's just how I walk and what I'm made of. But she held her ground, shifted the flour sack a little to one side, and waited. Her sister, younger, smaller, with eyes that looked like she'd been crying not long ago, and was working very hard to stop, moved up level with her. I stopped about 10 feet away. She said, "We are looking for work." Her English was careful. She formed each word like it cost something. "Any work, we do not ask much." I looked at them for a moment. Not unkindly, I hope, but straight. I was trying to figure out what I was actually seeing. They weren't from here. That was plain enough, the cut of the coat the younger one was wearing, the accent, something about the way they stood that wasn't quite frontier-born. But they were dressed plain, and they were thin, and the one with the flour sack had calluses on the hand that was holding it, which told me something. I said, "Where you coming from?" "Millhaven," she said. "Before that, Cologne, before that," she stopped. Said something in German to her sister, quick and quiet, then back to me. "It does not matter before that." That settled it, more than anything else she could have said. I told them I had a cook stove that needed a person to use it, a hen house that needed tending, a kitchen garden that was 3 weeks behind where it ought to be, and a bunkhouse that had nobody in it since the previous fall. I told them the bunkhouse wasn't much, but it was solid, and the roof didn't leak, and there was a proper stove in it. I told them I'd pay what I could, which wasn't much, but I'd pay fair and on time. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "What do you need from us first?" I picked up my wire and my pliers. I said, "Start with the chickens. They've been unsupervised for 2 days and they're going to be unhappy about it." That was the spring that changed things. I didn't know that yet. I was just a man with fence to fix. My name is Cord Haverson. I don't say that like it means anything. My father built the Haverson Ranch, 3,200 acres on the Cimarron Bench, 2 wells, good grass through June, summer pasture up in the breaks. He built it with his hands and a crew of 4 men who'd have followed him into a burning barn, and most of them did, one winter when the hay caught. I came back from the war and found the place more or less running but not well, and my father 10 years older than he should have been, and 4 years later he was gone and the place was mine. I was 31. I didn't have a wife. Hadn't had one, hadn't been looking. The kind of work I'd been doing in the war wasn't the kind that made you good company, and I'd figured that out about myself early enough to act on it. I ran the ranch. I hired men in the busy seasons and let them go in the slow ones. I went to town when I needed to and came home when I was done. Rimrock wasn't a bad town. It wasn't a good one either. It had a hardware store and a feed merchant and 2 saloons and a church that the Baptists and the Methodists took turns using because neither congregation could fill it alone. It had Everett Cade, who owned the bigger saloon and the livery and most of the notes on the smaller ranches around the valley. It had Dolph Stroud, who was marshal and who had been hired by the town council, half of whom owed Cade money. I owed Cade nothing. That mattered. I don't say it like I'm proud of it exactly, but it mattered the way things matter when you can feel the shape of the valley shifting and you want to know where you stand. The fever had come through the previous fall. September into October, then a cold snap that seemed to end it, then November, and it came back hard. It took Amos and Bess Pitcher, who'd had the homestead east of me. It took the Gruber family, all 4 of them. It took Reverend Lacey and 2 of the women who helped run the church. It took the schoolteacher, a young man named Pryor who'd been out here 2 years from Ohio and who'd been learning, you could see it, learning to belong to the place. By February, Rimrock had buried 19 people, and the rest of the valley was quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful. That was when Everett Cade started making noise about consolidation, about how small operations couldn't sustain themselves, about how certain ranches that had lost their owners were going to need a steady hand, about how it was a practical matter, not a hard one, just the shape of things. He said this at the feed store and at the hotel and at both saloons, and the men who listened to him nodded, because most of them owed him, and that is what men do when they owe somebody. He hadn't come to me about any of it. He knew better. But I was watching. I'd been watching since October. Sisters made the bunkhouse their own inside of 2 days. I don't know how exactly. I didn't go over there much. But the third morning I walked past it on the way to the south pasture, and there was a piece of cloth hanging in the window, not curtains, just a length of cotton with a pattern on it, folded over the rod, and there were 2 pairs of boots outside the door drying in the pale sun, and something about it was so deliberately alive that I had to stop and look at it for a second before I went on. Her name was Clara Hess. Her sister was Margit. Clara was 28, Margit 24. I learned this gradually, the way you learn things about people you work alongside, not from asking, but from hearing. Clara would say things to Margit in the kitchen in the mornings when I came in for coffee, and I'd catch a name, a date, and over time the shape of their story assembled itself without anyone having to tell it to me all at once. They'd had a father in Cologne, a cabinet maker. He'd brought them here 4 years back, some idea of a new life. He'd gotten as far as Kansas City before his lungs failed him, something he'd had since before they left, something he hadn't told them about, or maybe had, and they'd come anyway because there wasn't anything to go back to. They'd worked in Kansas City for 2 years. Then they'd heard about Millhaven, better wages at the textile mill there. The mill had closed in the winter. Millhaven was a dying town, and they'd known it before they left, but they hadn't had money enough to go anywhere else. And then the fever came to Millhaven too and took 3 women from the rooming house they'd been in, and Clara had looked at Margit one morning and said something, I imagined, that amounted to, "We are leaving today." I knew all of that before she told me any of it. What she told me eventually was less. She said, "We have been moving west because there was nowhere else to go. I think now maybe we have stopped moving." She said it matter-of-factly, not like she was asking me a question, not like she was making a claim on me either. Just stating a thing that appeared to be true. I said, "You're welcome to stay as long as there's work." She looked at me a certain way, steady and straight and a little bit like she was measuring something. Then she went back to the bread she was making. She had flour on her forearm up to the elbow and she didn't bother wiping it. I thought about that look for the rest of the day. The first real trouble came in May. I'd expected something. The valley was too quiet and Cade was too busy for there not to be something coming. What I hadn't expected was that it would come at the sisters first. I was in Rimrock for a Saturday. Feed and hardware, a bill to pay at the hotel where I sometimes had my mail held. I'd left Clara and Margit at the ranch. I'd thought about it before I left, thought about it the way you think about something that you tell yourself isn't a concern, and then think about it again because it actually is. They were fine when I left. Margit had been working on the kitchen garden and Clara was doing the accounts with me. I'd started having her do the accounts because she was faster at figures than I was, and she saw errors I didn't, which I'd told her plainly because it was true and she deserved to know it. I got back in the late afternoon. 2 horses were tied at my fence that I didn't recognize. I came in slow, tied my own horse at the gate instead of the post. Went to the house by the long way around, past the tool shed, which took an extra 5 minutes but put me at the back door instead of the front. Pete Arbuckle and a man I didn't know, younger, hat pulled low, were in my kitchen, not my house, my kitchen. Pete worked for Cade. He ran errands and collected on notes and occasionally did things that weren't either. The younger man I didn't know, but I knew what he was by the way he was standing, which was the way men stand when they're being paid to make people nervous. Clara was at the table. She had the account book closed in front of her and her hands flat on top of it, and she was looking at Pete Arbuckle the way she'd looked at me that first morning across the field. Steady, measuring, no flinch. Margit was over by the stove. I could see from the door that she had a cast-iron pan in her hand that she'd picked up and wasn't putting down. Arbuckle was talking about Mr. Cade's interest in adjacent properties, and whether the ladies had given any thought to their situation being temporary, and how Mr. Cade was a generous man to people who came to him early rather than late. He stopped when I opened the door. I came in without hurrying. I went to the stove and I picked up the coffee pot because there was coffee in it, and I poured myself a cup, and I turned around and leaned against the stove and looked at him. I said, "Pete." He said, "Cord." I said, "These women work for me. This is my kitchen. You want to have a conversation, you have it with me in town on a weekday, and you tell Cade I said so." Arbuckle had a practiced look for moments like this, a kind of patient, sideways smile that was meant to suggest he wasn't bothered and you probably ought to be. I'd seen it before. I looked at it and waited. He said, "No need to be unfriendly." I said, "I'm not being unfriendly, Pete. I'm being clear." He left. The younger man followed him without having said anything at all, which was maybe the thing that bothered me most about it, that he'd been brought along not to speak but to be seen. Margit put the pan back on the stove. She said something fast in German. Clara said to me, "He came about an hour ago." I did not let them pass the kitchen. I said I was sorry I hadn't been here. She shook her head just slightly. I am not a person who needs to be apologized for. Not angry, just correcting a fact. I would like to know what he wants, though, specifically. So I told her. About Cade, about the notes, about the dead ranches and what he was trying to do with them. I told her all of it because she'd asked, and because she had a right to know what was around her. She listened, and then she said, "And he cannot take this ranch." "No, because you owe him nothing." "That's right." She looked at the closed account book on the table. "Then we should make sure it stays that way." I sat down across from her, and we talked about it for an hour, and I want to say clearly that she saw things in it I hadn't thought of. Not big things. She wasn't a general. She thought the way a person thinks who has learned to look at problems from the angle of someone with fewer resources, which means she thought carefully about small things that could become large things, and two of those small things she pointed out turned out to matter a good deal before the summer was over. I want to talk about what the ranch was like that spring, with them there. I'm not a man who talks about things like that usually, but you asked me how it all happened, and some of it is it's just what it was like. A Tuesday morning. The smell of coffee and wood smoke and bread. Margit talking to the chickens in German, which she did every morning, and which the chickens seemed to accept without complaint. Clara at the table by the window doing the accounts, or mending something of mine she'd found in the bunkhouse and decided was too far gone to leave alone, or writing in that small leather book she kept, writing what I didn't ask. I'd been alone on this land for 4 years. I want you to understand that right, because I'm not telling you I was miserable. I wasn't. I knew the shape of my days, and I was able inside of them. But a ranch is a lot of ranch for one person, and there is a kind of quiet that stops being peace and starts being something else, something that gets into the wood of the place, and you don't know it's there until it isn't anymore. That spring the quiet was different. It wasn't gone, it was still a quiet place, but it was a full quiet if you understand what I mean. There were voices in it now and footsteps on the porch, and one evening I was coming in from checking the herd and I could see the lamplight in the bunkhouse window through the trees, and I stopped walking for a second. Just stopped, and stood there looking at it. I moved on, but I didn't forget it. I want to tell you about the night in June that things shifted, because that's what this whole thing turns on, really. It was a Monday, and I'd been in Rimrock for a meeting that the town council had called, ostensibly about water rights on the creek that ran through 4 properties on the east side of the valley, but really just another venue for Cade to hold court, and for everybody to sit there and decide whether they were going to let him. I'd gone because I owned water rights upstream, and because I wanted him to see my face. The meeting had gone 4 hours, and accomplished nothing, except that Cade had made 2 separate speeches and Stroud had nodded through both of them. And a man named Eli Foss, who ran cattle east of town, had said something quietly that needed saying, and then sat down when Cade looked at him, which I understood because Foss had a note coming due in August. I got home after dark. Late, the lamp in the main house was still lit, which surprised me. Clara was at the table. She had coffee on and a plate of something covered with a cloth. She looked up when I came in, not startled. She'd heard the horse. And then she looked at my face, which I was not being particularly careful about at that moment, and she said, "Sit down." I sat, she poured coffee, and she uncovered the plate, which had cold cornbread and the last of the salt pork from supper. I ate because I was hungry and because I hadn't eaten since noon. She sat across from me and she said, "How did it go?" I told her all of it. Not the way I'd tell it to another rancher, abbreviated, factual, but all of it. Because it was late and I was tired, and she was sitting across from me asking the question like she actually wanted to know, like it mattered to her what happened in that room. And it had been a long time since somebody had sat across a table from me and asked a question like that. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Foss, he has a note with Cade." "Yes, August. That's what I understand." She was thinking, I could see it. She'd go still when she was thinking hard, like something that looks calm because all its motion has gone inward. Then she said, "If someone were to buy that note or lend Foss the money to pay it, Cade loses the leverage." I looked at her. She said, "I am not saying you have the money for it. I am saying it is the kind of thing that changes the arithmetic." She paused. "I have been doing your accounts for 6 weeks. I know what you have and what you don't. I would not suggest it if I thought it was impossible." "It's close to the edge." "Yes, but so is Foss, and so is the Valley, and right now you are the one person Cade cannot pressure." I sat with that for a minute. The lamp was burning low and she reached over and turned it up without getting up, just reached, and the light got steadier. I said, "You've been thinking about this." "Since May," she said. "Since Arbuckle came." I looked at her across the table in that steadier light, and there are moments you see a person. I mean, you see them. You see what they are and what they cost themselves and what they're made of, and this was one of those moments. I'd known she was capable. I'd known she was steady. I hadn't known how far out ahead of trouble she'd already been thinking, or that she'd been thinking about it on my behalf, on behalf of the ranch. I said, "It's a risk." "Yes," she said, "but you are the kind of man who is good at risk. You just need to choose the right ones." I don't know if she meant it the way I took it. I thought about it after, tried to figure out if she was just being practical or if there was something else in it. I decided it didn't matter right then. What mattered was that she was right. I went to see Eli Foss the next morning. I don't need to take you through all of it. Some of it was just the work of summer, the cattle, the fence, the water, the long days and the short nights, and the particular kind of tired you get in July when you've been going hard since April, and you can see the end of it but can't quite feel it yet. Foss took the loan. It took me 3 weeks to sort out the banking of it, and Clara helped me draft the letter because my written language is functional but hers is better. When Cade found out, and he found out quickly because this was a small valley, he sent Stroud to talk to me on some pretext about grazing rights. Stroud stood in my yard and talked for 10 minutes about nothing, and I stood there and listened because sometimes that's all you have to do. Just let a man talk until he runs out of words and has to go home. 2 other ranchers came to me in July. Smaller operations, both of them. They'd heard about Foss and they wanted to know if I could do something similar. One of them I could help with, one I couldn't, but I pointed the second one toward a man in the county seat who I knew was fair and told him what to say. I don't know what he did with it. I heard later he kept his place. None of this made me a hero. I want to be clear about that. I didn't go into it to be anything. I went into it because Cade was taking things from people, and I had the means to be an obstacle to a certain amount of that, and I didn't see the point in not doing it. My father built this ranch to be something that stood. That's what I was trying to do with it. But people saw it differently, and I couldn't stop them. Rimrock started being different with me. Men who'd nodded at me in the feed store and said nothing more began stopping to talk. Women who'd known me for years as a distant figure, the Haverson boy, the bachelor rancher on the bench, I don't know how to say this, began treating me like someone who existed in a fuller way. Like I was a fact in their world now, not just a landmark. I didn't entirely trust it. I didn't entirely dislike it either. What I want to tell you about is August. The haying was done. We'd had a good cut and I was satisfied, and the ranch had a settled feeling to it in early August that I always appreciate. The year's work mostly behind you, and the fall still far enough ahead to breathe. Clara had started teaching Margit to ride that summer, which I'd offered, and she'd accepted on Margit's behalf because Margit was wary of the horses, but her pride wouldn't let her say no to a thing her sister could do. I'd given them an old bay named Sutter who wouldn't spook at anything, and by August, Margit could handle him at a walk and a slow trot, and she was proud of it in that careful way she had, like she didn't want to claim too much in case it got taken back. One afternoon, I came in from the north field, and Clara was in the yard with 2 cups of coffee, sitting on the fence rail, watching Margit make a wide, slow loop on Sutter at the far end of the pasture. She handed me a cup when I came up beside her without me asking for it, without looking at me. Just handed it over. We watched Margit for a while. Clara said she is starting to enjoy it. I can see that. She wouldn't admit it. No, probably not. We drank our coffee. A red-tailed hawk went over, riding something up high. Sutter didn't care. Margit sat him better than she had a month ago. She'd learned to stop fighting the motion, let it come through her instead of bracing against it. Clara said, I think you saved more than just the Foss land this summer. I said, Foss saved Foss land. I just made it easier. She looked at me then. Level and straight, the way she always did, but there was something more in it, something that had been building over the months and that I'd been aware of without quite letting myself be aware of it. She said, you know what I mean. I said I supposed I did. She put her cup down on the fence rail. I want to tell you something. I am not a person who says things she does not mean, so you should know that I mean this. She paused. Not a pause of uncertainty, a pause of precision, of finding the right words in a language that was hers by work, not birth. When we came here, Margit and I, we had been through enough that I had stopped thinking about staying anywhere. I thought in terms of the next place, the next town. I did not think in terms of, as she moved her hands slightly, meaning the ranch, the pasture, Sutter, and Margit making their slow loop, in terms of this. I waited. I think about this now, she said. I think about it as a place I am in, not a place I am passing through. The hawk was gone. Margit was turning Sutter at the far fence, slow and patient. I said, I'm glad of that. I meant it more than those 4 words can hold. But they were the words I had, and they were true, and she seemed to understand them. She picked her cup back up, and we went on watching Margit. And eventually the sun moved, and we both had other things to get to. But when she'd climbed down from the fence, she'd put her hand on my arm for a moment, just a moment, her hand on my forearm through the sleeve of my shirt. And it was such a plain, deliberate thing, such an unhurried thing, that I felt the weight of it for the rest of the afternoon. I want to tell you about September, about the night that settled it, because there's always a night that settles it, one way or another. Cade made his last move in late August. He'd been working all summer on the pitcher place, Amos and Bess Pitcher, who died in the fever, and he'd gotten his hands on it finally by some arrangement with a cousin in Wichita that I never fully understood the details of. Having the pitcher place gave him water he didn't have before, and it put him adjacent to 3 other properties, and I could see exactly what his thinking was. He also, through Stroud, filed a complaint with the county about supposed water diversion on my north section. There was no diversion. It was a harassment, and we all knew it was a harassment, but harassment through the law takes time and money to fight off, and Cade knew that too. I'd need to go to the county seat, several days, maybe a week. I wasn't worried about the case. I had my records, and Clara had helped me organize them, and they were clean, but I was worried about leaving the ranch. I told Clara about it the evening before I planned to leave. She was at the table. She had the ledger in front of her, but she'd stopped working on it. She listened to me explain the situation, and then she said, "You're worried about us while you're gone." "I'm worried about the property." She said, "The property and us." I said, "Yes." She said, "Cord." She almost never used my name directly. When she did, it had a weight to it, like she'd decided to pick it up and carry it. "We are not helpless, and we are not going anywhere." I said I knew that. "Do you?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a real question. I said, "I know you're not helpless, and I know." I stopped. She waited. I said, "I know you're not going anywhere." A pause. "I hope that's true." She closed the ledger. She folded her hands on top of it. "It is true," she said, "because I have decided it is true, not because I have nowhere else to go. That is not why I am here anymore." She looked at me straight. "I want you to go to the county seat and fight this thing and come back. That is what I want." There is a kind of clarity that a person gives you. A real person who isn't performing anything and isn't trying to give you something soft to lean on, but is just telling you what is true. There is a clarity in that is better than almost anything. I said, "Then I'll come back." She nodded once, like that settled it. I left the next morning. She was in the doorway when I rode out, her arms crossed against the early cold, and she watched me go until the trees took me. I was gone 8 days. The county process was what it always is. Slow, procedural, mildly absurd, full of men who knew the complaint was thin, and were taking their time about it anyway because time was what they had to sell. My lawyer, a man named Crispin from the county seat who I'd used twice before and who had no patience for theater, filed the counter-documentation on the third day, and we spent the next 4 days waiting for people to read papers they could have read the first morning. I won't say I wasn't irritated. I was, but I'd known going and what it was going to be. Cade's complaint was dismissed on the 7th day. I started home on the 8th. It was a 2-day ride, and I rode the first day hard and camped in the breaks and lay there looking at the sky and thought about the ranch, about the things waiting to be done, about the herd, about the fence line on the south section that needed another look before first frost. I did not let myself think too directly about Clara. I thought about her anyway. I thought about her saying her name like she'd decided to carry it. I thought about her hand on my arm. I thought about the look she'd given me across the supper table in June when the lamp was low, and then she'd turned it up, not making a thing of it, just turning it up. I thought a woman like that does not spend her energy on a man she has not decided about. She is too precise, too deliberate. I thought, be careful. I thought that 3 or 4 times, and then I stopped thinking it because it wasn't changing anything. I came in on a Thursday midday. The sky was clear and bright, and had started to have that September quality to it, that beginning of blue sharp that tells you summer is counting its last days. The ranch looked right. That was the first thing. I could see it from half a mile out, and it looked like a place that was being kept, which sounds like a small thing, but it isn't. It looked alive. Margit saw me first. She was in the kitchen garden, and she waved. And I waved back, and she went inside, and by the time I'd unsaddled and rubbed down the horse and put him up, Clara was coming across the yard. She wasn't hurrying. She walked the way she always walked, with purpose and without waste. She was wearing her working clothes, the dark blue dress with the collar she'd mended at some point during the summer with thread that almost matched. She was looking at me. I said, dismissed. She said, good. Then, after a moment, you look tired. I'm fine. You look tired, she said again, not arguing, just accurate. She stopped in front of me. She looked at my face the way she'd looked at it that very first morning, measuring, only this time I knew what the measuring felt like from the inside of it, which is not at all unpleasant when the person doing it is someone you trust. She said, come inside, I'll put coffee on. I said, Clara. She waited. I said, while I was gone, I stopped, tried again. I didn't think about much except coming back. She looked at me for another moment. Then she put her hand on my chest, her palm flat against my shirt, right there in the yard in the September noon, and she said quietly, then you came back to the right place. She kept her hand there for a moment. I put my hand over hers. It's that simple and that complicated, and I am not going to make more of it in the telling than it was in the doing, which was 2 people standing in a yard in September, and one of them had her hand on the other one's chest. And they both knew what they were and what they'd been building toward all spring and summer, and they didn't have to say anything else right then. Margit called from the house. The coffee was on. We went in. Cade made one more attempt. October it was. He had Stroud come to see me about some new thing, a boundary question, something about the pitcher property line. I listened to Stroud on my porch, and I told him to have Cade send me a written notice through a lawyer if he had a legal matter, and otherwise I wasn't interested. Stroud stood there and looked like a man who knew he was wasting his time and had been told as much and was going to have to go back and explain that to somebody. He left. I stood on my porch for a while after and looked at the bench and the valley below it and the far hills. There was frost on the grass already, just the tips of it, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, the whole line of them yellow as anything against the blue sky. I heard the door behind me. Clara came out and stood beside me, her shoulder not quite touching mine. She was holding a cup of coffee, and she was looking at the same thing I was looking at. She said, he won't come back. I said, no. Not this season. Not for a while, I said. She was quiet. Then, the valley looks different than it did in the spring. It does. Better. I looked at it, the frost and the yellow and the blue, the herd in the middle distance, just the shapes of them. Yes, I said, better. She handed me her coffee cup, and I took a drink from it and handed it back. We stood there. The sun moved a degree, 2 degrees. the light shifting the way it does in fall, going gold and then more gold and then something past gold that doesn't have a name. The kind of light that happens in October in that particular hour before the afternoon tips toward evening. And it came across the bench and across the valley and across the frost-tipped grass, and it hit the cottonwoods and they lit up like they'd been waiting for it all day. Clara said nothing, I said nothing. The light did what light does. And I stood there with it and with her beside me, and with the valley that had been through a bad year and was still here, still turning, still made of something that held. And I felt, in a way I don't have better words for, like a man who is exactly where he should be. That's what I have to tell you. That's all of it. The fever took the ones it took, and the spring came anyway, and 2 women walked out of it carrying a flour sack, and one of them decided in her own time and for her own reasons that this was the place she was going to stop moving. I'll take that. I'll take that and be grateful for it every morning I wake up on this land.